Thanks a lot, Wes, and thanks to the ASIL and the Lieber Society for hosting our event. And this is an event, as you know, on artificial intelligence in international humanitarian law, the legal and ethical implications of emerging disinformation and decision-making technologies. AI has profound implications for the roles of humans, technology, and human-machine interactions in armed conflict. In particular, it contributes to the development of autonomous weapon systems, new forms of information warfare, and military decision-making processes. So we're going to explore in this panel the use of AI, the foundations of AI, with a focus on disinformation technologies and decision-making processes. Recently, the National Security Commission, U.S. National Security Commission, published a significant report on artificial intelligence in which they concluded that the U.S. must act now to field AI systems and invest substantially more resources in AI innovation to protect its security, promote its prosperity, and safeguard the future of democracy. So tonight we're going to explore some of the premises of AI, and we're going to begin with Dr. Nicole Turner-Lee, who is a senior fellow in governance studies, the director of the Center for Technology Innovation, and serves as co-editor-in-chief of Tech Tank at the Brookings Institution. I'm going to throw a link to Tech Tank in the chat so that you can all hit on that really useful online publication. She researches public policy designed to enable equitable access to technology across the US and to harness its power to create change in communities across the world. Her work also explores global and domestic broadband deployment and internet governance issues. She's an expert on the intersection of race, wealth, and technology within the context of civic engagement, criminal justice, and economic development. And I should add that I've had the pleasure of seeing her speak in person at Brookings. She's a very impressive speaker and really taught me the little I know about databases and inherent bias. So Dr. Turner-Lee.
Well, thank you so much, Marianne. You raised the bar so high. I feel like I got to really bring it tonight because being virtual is a whole different ball game than being in person. Well, first and foremost, I want to say thank you to Marianne for inviting me and also to ASIL for having me and distinguished guests and attendees at this seminar. And so as it was discussed, you know, the work that I do at Brookings, particularly as the director of the Center for Technology Innovation, is really looking at regulatory and legislative gas stops here in the United States and globally. And my portfolios are distinct because I not only deal with artificial intelligence, particularly algorithmic bias, but also the digital divide. So I have to put a shameless plug in that I have a new book coming out later this year on the US digital divide that actually looks a little bit at the correlation between AI bias and the digital divide that we actually see, particularly coming out of this pandemic. But let me go into the topic in my short period of time of my point of view, and I think we're going to have Q&A afterwards, and I'm excited to hear from my distinguished colleagues on their opinions. I want to focus primarily on why it's so important to have a conversation about AI, and not just AI and its weaponization when we talk about military disablement or the use of turning systems against ourselves, as we've seen with the use of AI with cybersecurity attacks. But I want to talk about the type of AI that actually goes at the core of our democracy, where it manipulates and exploits people who have historically been manipulated and exploited. It's no secret that we began talking about algorithmic bias many years ago. I tell people now, I think it's an established fact that bias does exist, whether it's something that we saw in the election integrity of 2016, where algorithms were used to play off of the vulnerabilities of exploited populations whose vote was already suppressed, to where we are today, where we're looking at the COVID vaccination passport and the use of that information to make determinations on people's eligibility for insurance or eligibility for work. And we're seeing that not just at the machine learning side, if I may add, we're seeing it at the deep learning side. There are now hiring algorithms that look at the way that you smile and the way that your eyes actually go that are proven to disadvantage Black and Latino workers who are not part of the body of training data in which many of these models are based on. So I share that because they're more ubiquitous than we think. We all thought that algorithms were just recommending movies when we were watching movies at home, and we thought algorithms were telling us what color blue dress to buy. But they actually go further, and researchers have found that Latanya Sweet at Harvard University has suggested that Black and Latina sounding names get higher interest credit card offerings or higher rates of ads that are actually discriminatory, pushing them towards their arrest records versus more productive products in commerce. Given that, I think that that is even more of a threat, particularly when we look at issues of domestic terrorism and how algorithms are being used to sort of feed into mis and disinformation, because the algorithmic economy in and of itself is technically designed to be discriminatory. Some of you may not like what I say when it comes to that, but it's the truth, right? I have certain likes, affinity groups, and interests that I actually tap into, and that's all I see. Well, guess what? I often tell people it's like being on a playground as a little kid. Some people are on the monkey bar, some people are on the swing, some people are on the sandbox. In the algorithmic economy, the white supremacists are on the swings, the Black Lives Matter people on the sandbox, and everybody else, like the cyclists and the outdoor hikers, are all in the new playground. And that playground has contributed to misinformation and disinformation as well as polarization. So I share that not to scare the heck out of you, but to actually think about, hopefully we'll do this in this conversation, things that I think about at Brookings in terms of how do we break this logjam. First and foremost, I would say in my remaining time, it's very important to have these discussions around global governance. Not just what does an AI framework look like in the United States or Singapore or other places, but what are the standards in which we live by? What are the human values and principles? What are the norms in terms of design? And how do we actually figure out areas in which we can collaborate and areas where we know that there's going to be great co-optation that may lead to greater weaponization? I think that's really important because there are lots of conversations going on internationally about standards, but they're not necessarily done in a way that we're all in the same room. I think the second thing that we have to do, we want to deal with AI bias, is we have to recognize that bias exists. We all come to the table as technologists, as you and users, with our values, assumptions, norms, and understandings about the world. And those get baked into these models quickly. Facial recognition doesn't recognize people with darker skin hues because there's not a lot of people at the table building these technologies that look like me. Let alone facial recognition doesn't often recognize when people like me change my hair because there's not a lot of people around the table that look like me. So we have to do a better job of thinking about what are the biases systemically that structurally value oriented, are norms oriented that we bring to the table that may stifle our ability to create equitable, responsible, fair, and lawful AI. And that brings me to my third and final point, which is we need to welcome people like myself to the table, not just because of my demographic background, but because of my academic interests and perspective. I've been pushing this model at Brookings that we need to have more seats at the table when it comes to AI development, management, execution, impact assessments. More engineers need sociologists like myself as friends and vice versa. Because at the end of the day, it's going to be in that collaborative design and execution of business products and services or public interest products and services that are going to keep in remembrance the importance of human and civil rights law. We just finished up a project at Brookings, we'll be publishing on this shortly, where we looked at every civil rights statute in the United States to look at how they apply in the digital space. And what we found is that they're insufficient. Those laws that were designed for public accommodation in the 60s really do not apply to the opaque internet, where I talked about, which is kind of divvied out by this algorithmic economy that maintains polarization. So we need to go back and have conversations of how do we bring the best minds to the table, to have the conversations like we're going to have tonight if we're going to think about not just fair and responsible AI, not just AI that has the vulnerabilities of potentially being weaponized, but AI that starts with a floor of lawfulness. You cannot correct unlawfulness if you don't have a floor for what lawfulness looks like. And I can go on and on in terms of privacy and other things that we in the United States and other countries have not fared equally around. But I share that because no one in the weaponization or the use of AI should feel like their civil rights or human rights are regressed upon. People work too hard for that. I always am remembrance of John Lewis, the great civil rights leader, who worked hard for voting rights, but yet in 2016 we had so many people whose voting rights were suppressed, and they could not go to the Supreme Court to say that an algorithm stole my right to vote. And so I just want to close there by saying at Brookings, we're looking at all of these issues and we're really starting to have a conversation on how to move this from ideology to something that's more pragmatic in terms of the toolkit that you need to actually take on algorithmic bias training data, etc. So I look forward to all the questions. Marianne, thank you for having me. Hopefully I met your expectation. But at the end of the day, I'm very niche-based, as you all can tell, but very happy to be here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Turner-Lee. That was a fantastic way to start us off with really challenging information and questions. Terrific. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague who is better dressed than I and keeps appearing and disappearing, Major Nick Allen, who is going to introduce the military side of the panel.
Thank you, Marianne. Good afternoon, morning. Aloha, everybody. My name is Major Nick Allen. I'm the Chief of National Security Law for the 25th Infantry Division of the United States Army based out of Oahu, Hawaii. And it's my distinct pleasure to introduce to everybody today Dr. Matthew Turek. Dr. Matthew Turek is with the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, also known as DARPA. DARPA has a distinguished history of being on the leading edge of several technological advances over the past 80 years that a lot of people today take for granted in their lives. And in this particular context, in AI development, DARPA is definitely still heavily in the conversation, if not leading the way worldwide. Dr. Turek is one of those leaders in that institution. He is the acting deputy director of the Information Innovation Office. And he's been with DARPA, I believe, sir, since 2018. Of course, you'll correct me if I'm wrong there. And in his work at DARPA, he's been involved in several programs, including such programs as Guaranteeing AI Robustness Against Deception, also known as GUARD, and the Reverse Engineering of Deceptions program known as RED. And there are several other programs I'm sure that he'll be happy to discuss with you in a moment. Prior to going to DARPA, Dr. Turek was at Kitware, where he was on a team developing computer vision technologies. He's worked for GE Global Research, where he was conducting medical imaging and industrial inspection research. He has a doctorate of philosophy in computer science from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, a Master of Science in Electrical Engineering from Marquette University, and a Bachelor of Science in Electrical Engineering from Princeton University. A lot more degrees than I have. So he is a co-inventor on several patents and has written heavily primarily in computer vision. So with that, sir, I'll turn it over to you. It is definitely a pleasure and honor to hear from you today. Over.
Great. Thanks. Thanks so much for the introduction, Nick, and nice to actually see you face to face. I think last time we talked was on the phone. So as Nick said, I'm the acting deputy director and also a program manager for the Information Innovation Office at DARPA. DARPA was formed in 1958 in response to Sputnik. The purpose of DARPA is to prevent strategic surprise for the US government. DARPA actually falls under the Department of Defense in the US, but most of the employees like myself are government civilians, and even more than that, we're all term limited. So DARPA, essentially all the DARPA's government employees are on a clock, typically about a 4-year tour of duty at DARPA. So as Nick alluded to, DARPA's had some significant impact on the arc of technology, things like GPS and stealth and the internet, and more recently, messenger RNA vaccines. So things that have touched you in your everyday life that you might be using now. There's a lot of misconceptions out there about DARPA. It turns out we're actually a funding agency. That's what we do. We have a budget of about $3.5 billion a year, and we fund academic and industry and not-for-profit researchers to work on problems that we think are critical to the security of the United States. So the office that I'm in, the Information Innovation Office, dates back into about 1960, actually. So we are there's a couple changes in how the office was structured, but that history again goes back to 1960. Folks that helped develop the internet. Some of the foundational investment in artificial intelligence came from DARPA. And as Nick mentioned, we continue to make significant investments in that space. but we're probably heavily outweighed by what is getting invested by commercial industry. So, there's the Googles, Facebooks, Amazons of the world make significant investments. By way of background, I have a bunch of technical degrees. I am not a lawyer. I am not a policy expert. I have learned to constrain my comments to that I know about, which is going to be the technology piece. I'll tell you a little bit briefly about the research investments that we've made in the space of disinformation, and then also a couple programs that I own on fundamental research in artificial intelligence. So in the disinformation space, I own, as a program manager, 2 programs, one the media forensics program, and then a follow-on called the semantic forensics program. You can think of these colloquially as DARPA's programs to detect deepfake videos or other forms of manipulated media. It turns out that the media forensics program started before the term deepfakes even existed. A program manager prior to myself, who was very forward-looking, identified that with the trends in artificial intelligence, that synthetically generated media, automatically manipulated media might be a significant problem, and convinced the agency to invest. And when we invest, we make significant investments. So probably hundreds of researcher years of effort on that program, which ran approximately 2016 through 2020, with a little bit of work ongoing now. And so that program was focused on being able to automatically look at an image or video and provide a quantitative score as to whether we thought that image or video had been manipulated or altered or changed in some way. The follow-on program, the semantic forensics or semaphore program, which I started and now run, is looking broader than metaphor, right? The threat landscape has changed even very rapidly, even over the last few years. And so semaphore is not just looking at image and video, but text, image, video, audio, particularly looking across those modalities as we refer to them, and not just trying to determine if something was manipulated, but understanding where media comes from. Does media come from where it claims it comes from? This article claims to be from the New York Times. Is it? It claims to be from this particular author. Is it? And so that's the second task that we focus on. The third is what we refer to as characterization. Was something falsified? Was it altered for malicious purposes? If I have vacation photos and I insert a beach ball in it, nobody cares. Maybe it makes for a better photo. If someone inserts pixels associated with a weapon, maybe a handgun or a rifle in a protest, well, that was done for a very different purpose. Maybe it is a call to action. Maybe it is an attempt to polarize. Maybe it is just an attempt to falsify the record of what happened at an event. And so those are the core tasks that we are looking at and working on the Semaphore program. That's also a large DARPA investment over 4 years. That program is about a year old or so. So we've got about another 3 years worth of work. So those are core programs in the disinformation space. There's another one called INCA's, Influence Campaign Awareness and Sense Making, that started about a month ago. That is run by another program manager. And that's really trying to understand these global influence campaigns, understand the narratives that are used to frame influence campaigns, how they may have an impact on a particular audience, how they may be persuasive, and all of that to provide what we refer to as situational awareness. That might be for folks in the military, in the information operations or the public affairs community, to understand how messaging is being used against the U.S. government, U.S. forces, and so that allows, again, those types of people to have a better understanding of potentially of what is happening in the information environment. And so just to wrap up, I also own a couple programs in foundational AI technology development. I own our program in explainable AI. So trying to introspect machine learning algorithms to understand the sorts of decisions they're making. That's in support of both developers and subject matter experts who are creating the technology, to end users who are trying to understand decisions, and eventually perhaps to support policymakers and policy oversight. Each of those user communities has different needs for explanations, different needs for understanding how an algorithm is behaving. And so that's another key investment in foundational AI research. And then the final program I own is on trying to build common sense knowledge and representations into AI and machine learning systems. Part of that is to deal with the fragility of current AI systems. Part of that is to allow AI systems to better understand humans and to interact and relate with them. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of perspective of what DARPA is, where we invest, the sorts of efforts that we fund, and happy to turn it back over to the moderators.
Thank you very much for your opening remarks, sir. At this time, I'm going to pass it back over to Marianne to introduce our next panelist.
Our next panelist is actually one of the three organizers of this fabulous panel, and that is Professor Sherry Krebs, whom I had the pleasure of meeting through the American Society of International Law, Liber Society gathered. She's an associate professor at Deakin University's Law School in Australia and co-lead Law and Policy theme at the Australian Government Cybersecurity Cooperative Research Center. She is also an affiliated scholar at Stanford University Center for International Security and Cooperation, and she holds a doctorate and a master's degree from Stanford with honors, as well as an LLB and MA from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She has a number of publications in the field of AI, and I know, having read them, they are crisply written, really incisive, and very useful. And she's been published in a number of law journals in particular, and we will put the link to some of those articles in the chat for you. One of the articles that caught my eye was Law Wars Experimental Data on the Impact of Legal Labels on Wartime Belief. I got that wrong, the last part wrong, but that was published in the Harvard Journal of
National Security.
Of National Security, thank you. Anyway, I give you my colleague, Sherry.
Thank you very much, Marianne and Nick, and thank you, ASIL, for hosting this very timely and interdisciplinary event. I'm very honored to participate in the panel together with fantastic panelists from very different backgrounds and who can provide different and important insights. So I just wish to begin by acknowledging that I joined this panel today from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, lands that were never ceded, and I pay my respects for the elders past, present, and emerging. I also want to say that in the 10 minutes that were allocated to me, I want to take probably a couple of things that Dr. Turner-Lee have said and a few of what Dr. Turek provided, and try to put them together in the IHL context. And by that, I think that one of the main challenges that I see in the way that AI is currently applied to IHL, international humanitarian law, and the law of armed conflict, depending on who is looking at it. I think it's the way that AI is truly building the new narrative of IHL, and that's based on the way that we perceive IHL, the way that we think about what, AI, about the way that we think about what AI or artificial intelligence is doing in the law of armed conflict. And And I think that is something that goes beyond military decision makers and into society at large, which is another important issue that I would like to just briefly raise, and then happy to talk more about this in the Q&A. Because one of the things that AI does in the last decade or so, I think, is that it justifies a Western perspective of the law of war, and it provides a new sort of military heroism, even in the way that AI is constructed or construed as how we understand what is true in a military battlefield and how we conduct our fact finding. And so what traditionally used to be considered as something that would normally be given for a human judgment, with all the biases and imperfect that human judgment or human subjectivity is. I think we have decades now of research that tell us and teaches us more about how cognitive bias affects human decision makers. But we have less of that in. We have emerging literature, but it's not enough still in understanding how algorithms and artificial intelligence and machine learning technologies influence how we understand what is true and how we construct factual framework for military decision making. And in that sense, what has been happening is that we provide more and more of the decision making process to technological systems, some of which include AI components. And the problem is that while, and clearly some of this has been developed as a solution for some of the subjectivities and problems with human decision making. But while we do understand better some of the problems and limitations of human decision makers, human decision making, we know less of how these artificial intelligence systems influence human decision makers. And I think in the next spot, I think Rob will speak more about standalone AI systems. But what I wanted to focus on is AI systems, not as a standalone decision makers, but as decision assisting systems. And one of the things that I do in my scholarship is to look at that human-machine interaction within that process. So the way that AI and machine learning systems influence human decision makers and human judgment. And one of the things that I've done is I've analyzed several military investigations that looked at failed operations in which technological systems, including their AI components, were blamed, or were at least some of the errors or operational errors were attributed to those systems. And so one of the things, obviously, that this leads to is to think about how those systems influence accountability, but not in the sense that so there are lots of legal scholarship looking at how, what's the problem with giving AI systems or machine learning systems to make decisions because they are not accountable. What I'm interested in is how that influences the accountability of the humans making decisions when their decisions have been relying on factual framework or evidence provided by those systems. And in that case, we can go back to Dr. Turner-Lee's comments about algorithmic biases and its difficulty in distinguishing between different people because of the way that it's been trained, because of the lack of diversity in some of the training databases for algorithms. And so obviously, when we develop these systems in the West and then apply them to people elsewhere in the global South, that creates some problems. We do know from different types of military investigations that there are several problems in the way that the systems that we have at the moment identify risk and identify people as military personnel or civilians. And so there are different limitations to those systems as they assist human decision makers that are not fully explored in the existing literature. So some of it is technological limitations that relate to the system itself, because clearly, those systems can only process the data that is that they are allowed or they are asked to collect, and so that data is necessarily limited by the way that, by the scope, and whether it's temporal or geographical scope. These systems can also malfunction. And when we tend to rely on technological systems, then it does something to our own human judgment. We tend to practice it less. And so when the system fails, then, it's like, we were using, I knew how to drive perfectly everywhere before I had GPS. But now that I do, it's really harder than to go back and try to navigate without it. And so this is one thing that that those type of technology-assisted decision-making system do for human judgment. We just practice it less, and we trust ourselves less, and then it makes us trust the system more. But because decision makers are not fully visible with some of the problems with the data collection and the data production and the error rates of the algorithms, that creates that causes us to trust the system with more than we should, because we're not aware to some of its limitation. And so beyond the technological limitations of these systems, we also have limitations or weaknesses that are directly related to the human tech interaction. And that includes some of the invisible subjectivity within those technology-produced information or evidence, because some of it requires interpretation. And even if the interpretation is then written into an algorithm, some human had to write the algorithm. And so there is necessarily some level of subjectivity inserted into that system. And there are also some cognitive biases involved in this kind of tech-human interaction, including that some kind of emerging research, I'll say, in human-machine interaction demonstrate that, at least in when soldiers are using all kinds of visualization technologies that are designed to enhance their situational awareness, that actually can limit or harm their situational awareness, in the sense that they're just so focused on the visualization aid that it kind of limits their sensitivity to other types of information that perhaps are streamlined in other ways. It also can enhance other known cognitive biases, including availability bias, that basically the types of AI or visualization technologies provide some anchoring points that then are used without really questioning those anchoring points. So, and then at the end, what happens is that there is a new accountability gap that is not created because the system is at fault and we don't know what to do with that. The accountability gap is because when this interaction is faulty, then we really don't know where to put the finger at, because it's not really the human, but it's not also the technology, right? It's because we are not well enough trained to understand some of those limitations that those faulty interactions increased our tendency to make risk assessment errors. And so what I think should be our next step in that space is to first acknowledge the problem and put more resources, and Matt, maybe that's for you to put your money at. But I think really something that should be better explored in an empirical way is those human-machine interactions in a way that can assist, because I really don't think that AI makes decision necessarily worse, right? I mean, it was designed, at least in the military space, to provide more and more data that can help us to make better risk assessments. But to do that, we have to be more familiar with some of those challenges in how it actually may increase some of those errors that were identified in military investigations. And I'll put in the chat some of the research that I've done and exploring those particular military investigations. And I think that the most important thing would probably to rethink our accountability mechanisms, to look into some of those organizational rather than individual types of responsibility, and so kind of future looking accountability mechanisms that are designed to improve those processes that we rely on, rather than point the finger to a particular individual that made an error within that very complicated system. So I think my time is probably up, and I'll bring it back to Marianne, but happy to go back to any of that in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Very rich presentation. Thank you so much. Now over to Nick.
Thanks, Marianne, and thanks, Dr. Krebs. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our final panelist, Professor Rob McLaughlin. Professor Rob McLaughlin is a retired fellow judge advocate in the Australian Navy. So, sir, it's a pleasure to speak with you in that degree as well. So he's with, again, the Australian National University College of Law, located near Canberra, Australia. He researches, publishes, and teaches in the areas of the law of armed conflict, law of the sea, maritime security law, and maritime law enforcement and military law. He's routinely engaged with the International Committee of the Red Cross, the Australian Red Cross, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. He came to the ANU College of Law after a career again in the Royal Australian Navy, where he was a seaman officer and a legal officer. So he's primarily focused in related areas. His legal roles and work includes as serving as a fleet legal officer, a strategic legal officer, as a counsel assisting, I think it's a ship, HMAS Sydney. You can tell me, sir, if that is or not. And direct operations on international, as well as a director of naval legal services. He's very well written in matters of international humanitarian law and, again, the laws of armed conflict. Sir, I will turn it over to you for opening comments on your end. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Nick, for that very kind invitation. And again, it's an honour to be here with this very distinguished panel of people. Thank you for the invitation, and to ASIL for putting this on. And as Sherry indicated, we have a tendency in Australia. I stand on the land of the Ngunnawal people, and I just would like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. My aim in this talk today is simply to state why I think it's far more likely than not that we will see lethal AI in the maritime domain, regardless of whether we ever see the same level of adoption of that lethal AI technology ashore. This is for two reasons. The first is that two of the pressures that tend to exert precautionary pull on responsible states in their consideration of limiting the development of lethal AI ashore tend to exert much less precautionary pull at sea. And this means that states, I think, might end up being more adventurous with developing and deploying lethal AI at sea than they will ashore. The second reason is that this reduced precautionary pull will, I think, see states resolve a current debate about the potential status of AI-enabled vessels in favour of them being characterisable as warships, and thus able to access the belligerent right of attack at sea that is limited to warships under the law of naval warfare. All right, so let me begin with the first point, and it's simply this, that in the general debate about AI and LOAC, the fear of the Terminator end state, let's call it, and the complexity of the battle space tend to advocate caution in the adoption of such systems. But in the maritime battle space, the precautionary pull of these two concerns, I think, is reduced. So I'll explain. First, by the Terminator fear, I mean the overwhelmingly negative idea of lethal autonomous weapon systems with a brittle AI background in the urban battle space, making distinction decisions with lethal consequences amongst a mixed population of civilians, targetable civilians directly participating in hostilities, fighter members of organised armed groups, and combatants. However, at sea, the precautionary pull exerted by this concern about distinction, I think, is reduced because the maritime battle space is not as cluttered in the same way as the urban battle space. And in the law of naval warfare, this is a platform status-based targeting regime, not a people status-based targeting regime. And discrimination as to platforms is often easier than discrimination as to people. And it's not really fanciful, even in our current state of technology, to one day think about an AI-utilised database of all targetable platforms at sea and their indicia, whether it's silhouette, acoustic signature, electronic signature, etc. Essentially a Jane's fighting ships, for those who know what that publication is, that's plugged into an AI database. And this would make discrimination a significantly easier task at sea than in the urban battle space. The maritime battle space is also one where the likelihood of civilian injury or death or collateral damage to civilian objects can be mitigated by your speed, time, distance, permissive targeting options. That is, there's more space, there's fewer things in it. And when targeting a military objective, there's a higher potential that you can reduce collateral damage, often down to zero. However, the second factor at play is that at sea, this reduced precautionary pull factor is accompanied by an equally reduced precautionary pull factor in terms of the reluctance of states to go down potential lethal AI paths. And I think part of this is the force protection imperatives for expensive naval capabilities will make it almost impossible, I think, to dissuade states from exploring some level of use of lethal AI systems at sea, given the attraction, if it could be realised, of an almost collateral damage risk-free AI targeting system in relation to naval platforms. And indeed, I think in the maritime domain, we're already some way down this path, and Matt may be able to talk about this in the Q&A, but we're already some way down the path there with the Sea Hunter and other projects that are already in their prototype and deployment stages. So once again, my first point is simply this: the hesitancy inspired by the pressures that tend to militate against responsible states wanting to get too far down the lethal AI path ashore, those pressures being the Terminator fear, so-called, and the complexity of the battle space in terms of people status under the law of armed conflict. Well, this is much reduced when we consider the maritime battle space alone. So my second point is that there is a potentially restrictive factor militating against the broader use of vessel status lethal AI at sea, and that is that the attack permission scheme in the law of naval warfare is what platforms have the right of attack in the law of naval warfare is currently the subject of some debate and evolving state practice. This is primarily because there's still some uncertainty as to whether an AI-enabled ship or vessel can be labelled as a warship. This is not merely a bland lawyer's question about definition. It's actually central to the legal regulation of AI at sea under the law of naval warfare, because only warships hold the belligerent right of attack. So there's a really interesting question around whether an AI-enabled autonomous vessel can actually be a warship in the first place. So the definition of warship, which was originally found in a 1907 Hague Convention, but is now reflected in the Law of the Sea Convention, Article 29, is this: warship means a ship belonging to the armed forces of the state bearing the external marks distinguishing such ships of its nationality. No problem there for an AI vessel. Under the command of an officer duly commissioned, usually a naval officer, and manned by a crew which is under regular armed forces discipline. So the key question, as you'll have sort of gathered, is what does under command and crewed by a crew mean in an AI vessel context? Now, for some background, the IMO has 4 degrees of vessel autonomy that it's exploring at the moment in terms of regulation of maritime autonomous shipping more generally. And degree 4 autonomy means a fully autonomous ship, and it describes it as this: the operating system of the ship is able to make decisions and to determine actions by itself. So in essence, the ship is completely uncrewed, has no people in it. So if command and crewing, as this degree of autonomy anticipates, can not only be remote, but indeed subject really only to the very lightest touch, interference touch really, but otherwise you let the AI get on and do its job, might such a vessel at this level of AI-enabled autonomy still be classifiable as a warship? Why is this a question? Well, it's because, as I said, in the law of naval warfare, only warships have the belligerent right of attack. So if an AI-enabled vessel is going to be able to conduct attacks, such as the Sea Hunter is envisaged to do against submarines, then it will need to be characterisable under a warship, or we need to change the law. I can't see that happening. So if an AI vessel cannot be a warship, then under the law of naval warfare, the most it can be is an auxiliary. And whilst auxiliaries share the same liabilities of warship to attack, they can be targeted on site in the same way as a warship, auxiliaries do not have the same belligerent rights as a warship. So that means unless states arrive at the position that AI vessels can be warships, they will need to limit the function of such vessels to exclude belligerent rights, including attack. I personally do not think that this will be the case. I think that the reduced precautionary pool in regards to the use of lethal AI in the maritime battle space, plus the imperatives of force protection for large, expensive naval capabilities, particularly crewed capabilities, plus the fact that states are already developing lethal AI vessels, plus the relatively easy possibility for states to simply declare that AI vessels can be classified as warships, will tend to make the deployment of lethal AI in the maritime domain more likely, I think, than in comparison with the likelihood of deployment of equivalent lethal AI systems ashore in the Erman battle space. So thank you very much for the opportunity. Very keen to engage with everyone in the questions.
Thank you very much, sir. So everyone, you've been introduced to our 4 panelists. We have 4 fantastic experts in their various fields, and they're coming at the central discussion point of AI and disinformation and military decision-making from 4 unique angles. So in a moment, Marianne will go ahead and take over, and we'll provide the first few questions to the panels. And of course, Marianne and I would invite anyone who's got questions for the panelists to also, you can put them in the chat, or you can contact Marianne or myself independently, and we will do everything we can to make sure that we can get your question asked in the time that we have. Marianne, I'll toss it over to you.
Thanks. Yes, please throw your questions in the chat. Those were all great presentations, and they really ran the gamut from, how do we get this data? How is this data used? What are the inherent biases to how do we get to a point where we can ethically allow autonomous weapons to make lethal decisions, or can we get to that point at all? So that's a pretty broad spectrum. So I guess my first question would go back to Dr. Turner-Lee's presentation, because everybody's comments or what everybody's presentations talked about the use of artificial intelligence, which relied on algorithms, databases, which, as Dr. Turner-Lee laid out, contain the inherent biases, either people who created the algorithms of the databases they use, or are imperfect in the way they address the variety of human beings, if you will. So I guess my question is, how can artificial intelligence itself be made to obey the law?
What a question, Marianne. Thank you very much. Well, listen, I think that at the end of the day, we build these systems for the purpose of creating a level of efficiency. And there's always a curiosity, and I think Sherry's presentation also mentioned as well as Matt and Robert's actually, where this new technologies really are piquing our interest because of its cognition of repetitive functions that we've done well, but we've not done as expeditiously as machines. With that being the case, a lot of my work really focuses around human agency, because I think machines are just as fallible as human beings. And when you begin to think about the type of decisions that machines make, you have to draw it back to a person or a thing or a place or a series of correlated events. And what's more interesting about algorithmic models and artificial intelligence models is that they're not only looking at one variable, but they're looking at a variety of variables to make sense of a human condition or a condition of people, a place or circumstance. So I think when you talk about can it obey the law, I honestly don't think it can. And I've been very straightforward about the fact that we have to look at the way in which we mainstream systems offline and compare that to how we mainstream systems online. And we have in unfortunately in place systems that are predominantly discriminatory, and that's not necessarily pointing it as a racial equity concern, but discriminatory based on who's at the table. And when those decisions are made, just like for predictive systems, systems are based on the decisions that are made by people who are the predominant developers, and that comes with their point of view of the world. I can place it, for example, and I'll end here on predictive policing. The reason that predictive policing is so dangerous in the United States is because those systems harness the external variables and the systemic inequalities that are baked into our society historically. And when you start to put that into the canvassing of a machine, and it's so great to be met because, you know, DARPA is always of intrigue to people like me, right? We sort of think we know what you do, but we really know what to do. But when you start to think about how you harness that into some type of automation or robotics, you run the risk of an unintended consequence. And that's why in my research, our goal is not necessarily to make them obey the law, but to be built in compliance with the law. If we can build some of these systems in compliance with the law, what that means is computer scientists taking a social science class. It means that companies like Facebook, Google, training the developers on those attributes that are more sensitive in society, that bridge upon human and civil rights. Surveillance rules, rules around, you know, policing, rules around fair housing and credit. To me, those are foundational principles that are just key to systems that are universally deployed. And I like what Matt said, commercially deployed, because a lot of these systems are commercially deployed. They don't follow any rules because they're based on permissionless innovation, which lends up being permissionless forgiveness. So I'll stop there. But, you know, I'm one of those people, like, I think, you know, I'm not a lawyer. I've been working in organizations when I was in advocacy that were law firms focused on civil rights. But when I look at these systems, I think to myself that they are replications of who we are as humans. And if we are an example of what is supposed to be model citizens, and we're wrong, we've built machines that are inherently biased because that's who we are as individuals with regards to our behaviors and likes and affinities. And it just picks up on that. And that's what scares me about it. And that's why I'm a sociologist and not a scientist doing this work, because I can look at it a different way. But I think that's where that synergy really is important.
Would anybody else like to comment about Dr. Turner-Lee's or add to that?
I'll be happy to, because first, of course, I agree with Dr. Turner-Lee, but I wanted to kind of push this point a bit even further, because when we think specifically about IHL or the law of armed conflict, we think normally that these are rules that are designed to guide behavior during armed conflict. So, for example, they tell us that during an armed conflict, we need to distinguish between civilians and combatants, and we can only attack combatants, right? The problem is that what some of those AI-based technologies do in that space is push or extend the jurisdiction of IHL beyond that kind of normative framework and into actually classifying specific people into combatants and civilians, which is normally not something that, you know, the legal regime generally does. So the problem is that now we have this proto-jurisdiction, and this is something that I take from, you know, Fleur Jones' work in this space about data practices in legal regimes more broadly. But I think that what happens specifically in the regime of the law of armed conflict is that now this specific legal framework does more than it normally or traditionally did. And using those technologies, we can now determine by very kind of numerical and concrete probability that that individual is a legitimate target or not. And I think in that sense, this kind of mixture of facts and law is another challenge that really challenges this assumption that, you know, those systems obey the law, because they actually, you know, pushes its boundaries in the application of those legal rules.
I'd actually like to, Marianne, if I could jump in for a second, because here I think that's a great segue point. We've heard some good or excellent discussion on the inherent problems that can infect artificial intelligence depending on who's developing the technology, drafting the algorithms, and so on and so forth. I'd like to actually go ahead and segue the conversation now to a discussion on how do we identify those actors, those human actors, the attribution conversation point. And Dr. Turk, particularly, I'd like to give you the opportunity to discuss some of the work that your program has been doing in that regard. You've made some references to Metaphor and Semaphore. Could you speak for a little bit about those two programs and kind of what they do to try to help identify individuals, really sources of certain algorithmic chains?
Sure. And I'm gonna, I guess, reflect back on some of the previous discussion before I do that. So one comment, I mean, I think you need to be really careful using a phrase like cognition with something like artificial intelligence or machine learning right now. We're pretty far from, we might talk about a system that has better than human performance in a very narrow domain, but equating that to the human cognitive process, we're very far away from that. So, asking the question, can you make an AI system obey the law? That's equivalent to asking, in my opinion, can you take that tool and make it obey the law? It's really the process that that tool is embedded in. How do we make that process? The individuals who are involved in that process, how do we make that legal and compliant and behave the way that we want to? So, the cautionary note there is just to make sure that we don't subscribe more capability to AI and machine learning systems than's actually there. We're pretty far from, highly general human level AI systems. The other comment that I'll make before I turn to Metaphor, Semaphore is, the problems like bias that Nicole and Shiri raised, those are very real, but it's not just the data and it's not just the people that are involved. There's actually very deep technical challenges around, some of the mathematical approaches that are used to build current AI and machine learning capabilities. So that's not to minimize the issues that were raised already. That sort of adds to the pile, unfortunately. So it's not simply, can you control the data that you're using to build a machine learning algorithm? There's actually, I think, personally, and there's some support for this in the literature, that there's things that we just simply need to do differently from a technical perspective. And it's not clear what those new steps need to be. Okay, so turning back to the question that Nick actually asked about things like attribution. This is a key question for some of our US government partners. And I'll bring this issue up here because I think it's relatable. Because of how operational authorities are structured in the US government, certain transition partners like the FBI need to know that it's a foreign actor that's involved before they can engage. Other parts of US government need to have other understandings of who's involved, and that's intertwined with their operational authorities. So this trying to decipher who's behind manipulated media, who's behind a disinformation campaign, that's actually a really critical problem. And then it's intertwined again with things like the operational authorities in those processes. So it's very early days in how to do this. We have some pretty high accuracy approaches for detecting certain synthetic media generators. So that's not the individuals that are behind it, but attributing the algorithms that were used to create something like a synthetically generated face. In certain conditions, that can be done with very high degrees of accuracy. That information about the tools that are used may provide some clues about who actually was behind it. But you're going to need to connect that information with other sources of information. Another way to think about maybe more advanced forms of attribution is to think about folks who've studied historical writers, and then you get a piece of writing that's not attributed. And there are ways to analyze that writing to see if the style is similar, the word use, all those things. So we're looking to automate those sorts of processes to understand for text, for instance, is this similar to a particular author? Another approach is work that was done on metaphor. It turns out that how we move our head when we talk and how our facial muscles move and the correlations between them, they're relatively unique from individual to individual. They are probably not as unique as a fingerprint, and we don't know for certain right now, but they're unique enough to allow us to build models that can defend specific individuals against things like deepfake attacks. By building these soft biometric models, again, of how you move, how your head moves, how your facial muscle moves. If you have a significant other that you're familiar with, they have typical gestures, they have typical movements that you're probably familiar with. So this is building models that understand some of those patterns, again, to defend individuals who might be targets. Think about government leaders, CEOs of companies. Eventually, you want that sort of technology to be broadly available. But anyways, that's another example of trying to build algorithms that are sort of focused in that attribution space. So let me stop there, and but hopefully that gives you a sense of some of the technical developments.
Does anyone else on the panel have thoughts to offer following Dr. Turek's comments? Otherwise, I've got a question from the chat, and there's a way I'd like to go ahead and feed in that direction. But I will still pause if anyone has any further observations to make on, again, attribution for in this technology lane.
Nicole?
So I actually don't have anything to add on attribution, but I do want to respond to Dr. Turek's comment about the technical cadence that we're actually exploring when it comes to these models. I do want to respond, though, with regards to the difficulty that technologists often identify when it comes to trying to correct for bias. That, to me, that's a lazy approach to how we actually look at computer science models and the discreteness of math. And I'll tell you why. One, we are already familiar with the fact that these models that we're dealing with are not causal, that there's no direct correlation because of the inferential economy that we pick up as a result of the digital ecosystem and the untethered access to people's information, composite profiles. So we never ask people, if I'm a Black woman, you find out, because there are other variables that can actually help you to surveil that data. I always tell technologists that I think it's important, though, that they think about improving upon technical cadence. So I'm developing what I call an Energy Star rating. I'm writing about it right now in a chapter in the book, which is really about thinking about what technical cadence looks like. How do you test this model? What's the context in which the algorithm or the AI is actually deployed? And how does it react differently under different contexts? And where do you actually disclose where there is going to be some technical inefficiency that shows up because you've not either put enough noise into the model, or it allows you to pick up those proxies that then lend itself to discriminatory behavior? So I think at the end of the day, it's one of those conversations, Dr. Turk, I think at the end, we need more people around the table to talk about this, because oftentimes my engineer friends are sort of saying, but I put in enough noise to desensitize these demographic variables, but they still find out that I'm a person who should be subjected to exploitative advertising online. So something is not right in terms of the noise that's being placed, because maybe we're not having the right interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary conversations to get us into the context of the deployment of that model. So I do agree with you that we're so much deeper than this. I always tell people we're way beyond machine learning algorithms, right? Because now we're picking up on other type of cues. But the question is, we have to do something on technical cadence, or in the work that I do, policymakers have to create some guardrails on what that technical cadence looks like, particularly when we're talking about life decisions that foreclose on opportunity or create, like Sherry said, missed targets. And we then go in and we have unintended consequences because the targets that we thought some of these autonomous surveillance tools were going to hit are wrong. And so just putting that out there, because I think that's where this whole conversation of social science as well as, technologists has been so fractured, and I'm really trying to bring us closer together, particularly in some of these technologies that have large implications.
Yeah, I certainly agree with you, actually, that we need that cross-disciplinary work. I mean, I think one of the things that's for where we are in AI and machine learning now is that we need that cross-disciplinary work. It's experimental psychologists, it is social scientists, it is also understanding the interplay with socio-technical systems and policymakers. All of those may inform technical requirements for the development process. So I agree with you completely, and my intent wasn't to minimize that process. It was just to surface the fact that there are actually, and this isn't an excuse, but there are some deep technical issues that also need to be chased and resolved as part of that broader process.
Yeah, no, thank you for that.
So I'll go ahead and move the discussion now towards the question that we'd received in the chat, which goes again towards a law of armed conflict kind of context. And I'll start the question by providing a bit of an example that we may be able to use to help discuss and analyze the question set. Now, the question primarily, and I think the best way to phrase it as it's written here is, if a war crime is committed by someone utilizing artificial intelligence, who is the war criminal, right? Is it the developers of the technology? Is it the entity that deployed the artificial intelligence? Is it the person, the soldier or what have you on the ground who was engaged in the activity that resulted in the war crime? Is it all of them? Is it only a couple of them? The scenario that I'll go ahead and provide, I think will help us to explain this a little bit more helpfully, is in the context of satellite spoofing. So some of you may be familiar with this, but artificial intelligence, particularly generative adversarial networks, have been employed in, I'm sure Dr. Turek can explain if he feels like it to a deeper degree, to make satellite imagery project things that do or do not, or things that don't exist, right? So for example, let's say in a particular battle space, you have a column of Humvees escorting some Red Cross vehicles, right, through a contested space. They are looking at satellite imagery that they think is accurate, showing that there is a bridge that goes across the river. So they continue to go down a road leading to this bridge that they think is there because the satellite imagery that they are receiving. Little do they know that an adversary has implanted that bridge on the imagery, and there is no actual bridge there. Instead, it's going to be an ambush point to ambush the medical vehicles, okay? The column proceeds to the bridge, the so-called, the apparent bridge area. They discover there's no bridge. The ambush opens up, and both the military escort and the medical vehicles and personnel are both attacked, and there are deaths that occur as a result. And this is, we'll just say for the purposes of simplifying, this is during an Article 2, for those of you who are unaware, Article 2 of the Geneva Conventions conflict. So this is state on state conflict, okay? In that circumstance, who do we think should be culpable or is culpable legally for that act, for the employment of the AI technology that causes them to go to an ambush point? Over.
I'll have a stab, Nick. I'll try and bring it back to your scenario. I guess the first thing to say, but and Shiri will certainly have a view on this as well, as will you, Nick, practicing in this area as well, is that, you know, when we're confronted with something that goes wrong on the battlefield, it's not always a war crime. And the first thing a judge advocate does is ask what happened and why did it happen? Only after that do you get to the question of, okay, was this a tragic but not unlawful mistake? Because that happens all the time on the battlefield, and these things are not war crimes. If we, however, get to the point was no, there was a war crime committed, there's a bit of a feedback loop in terms of, and Nick and Shuri will be able to speak to this as well. There's a bit of a feedback loop here. You know, it's difficult to just say that there was a war crime committed because we've got to get to a number of points before we conclude that. Because, you know, there's all sorts of issues of responsibility that go into this, and this gets to the core of the question. So my view is that if there's a war crime committed and an lethal AI system was involved, the first port of call, so to speak, is the commander, because the commander is responsible for the deployment decision always. But what that means is the mode of responsibility that we're looking at in that situation is command responsibility. This is not the same type of responsibility that I think the question, not Nick's question, but the original question in the Q&A is getting at, which is shooter responsibility. Because I think what the question on the Q&A was asking is, you know, who's the shooter here? How can we have responsibility, the shooter who committed the war crime, when the shooter was an AI system? But the issue is there's always a backup here in the law of armed conflict, that is command responsibility. Now, is that itself a simple thing? Absolutely not, because command responsibility itself is a very bivalent concept. You've got to work out whether this is, you know, you attribute the primary offence to the commander, or you attribute some sort of negligence or recklessness or even intention in the deployment of a faulty system. All those sorts of things. Is that easy to work out? No, but there's background to that, there's history to that, there's jurisprudence that deals with those issues. So it's not necessarily a novel issue. The second point I'd say is that there are potentially others in the chain, I guess, who might ultimately be responsible. Whether that's for a war crime or not is a different question. But I guess the one point I want to put is that the law of armed conflict builds in a whole number of touch points for the development and deployment of weapon systems, including in the future lethal autonomous weapon systems. And those are designed to reduce the potential for this to happen. Is there going to be human responsibility at these various touch points? Potentially. How will we work that out in the future? We'll have a look at product liability and all these other things that happen in the civil space in terms of autonomy. But I guess the reassurance I wanted to give, and Nick may have a view on this, is that there's always, you know, the ultimate bottom line is that there is the commander's responsibility. And there is a doctrine of command responsibility, which is complicated, but it is not novel. And so these things can be applied to AI systems. I'll stop there.
I'm happy to to take it from here, Rob, if we have a few more minutes, because I think the whole question should really be changed at this point, and because this is serving a particular, you know, moral system in which the problem is when individuals are faulty and commit crimes, but when other wrongful acts occur during war and people die and damage is caused, that's okay, that's lawful. And so I think we really need to rethink that in an area and in a situation where most of the damage during armed conflict is now not being committed intently by willful individuals, but by very, very complex system and in fragmented processes where a lot of people and technologies are involved. And so perhaps what we really need to do is shift the focus from the war crime as the ultimate evil in war into faulty systems and outcomes and damages, and what do we do about reparation and prevention in that sense, because I really think that this focus always going back to who is the war criminal is counterproductive, in the sense that even when it's just humans, even when it's just a single, human perpetrator that kills a civilian during war, it's rarely the case that that individual would be convicted in a war crime because of the very extreme circumstances and the very restrictive legal regime that requires this special intent and evidence about this special intent and the fog of war and everything, all the other metaphors about how we understand what happens in this stressful situation. It also does not necessarily help to improve outcomes in the future when we just, deal with those kind of few rotten apples rather than fix the system. And so perhaps the real question should be whether we should move away from the war crime kind of dominance in responsibility when thinking about responsibility for wrongful actions during armed conflict, and really move that conversation into reparation and prevention in a broader organizational context. And I'll stop there because we are stressed with time, and perhaps others can also comment.
So thank you, Shiri. Actually, I'm going to pass the floor over to a colleague of mine who's here, who's got a question particularly for Rob as it pertains to a targeting question at sea as it relates to AI. So I'll pass it over to Major Rothstein. Go ahead.
Hi, all. I appreciate the time there. Appreciate the comments there. And my question really was sparked by Professor McLaughlin's discussion on the targetability of an AI ship in the maritime battle space. And I think we can all agree in the warfight, C2, command and control, is targetable. And while AI itself is not a cognitive function, and we're not going down that road, it's not a cognitive function in of itself, it's assisting in the cognitive decision-making process. And so if we're talking that current battle space, we're trying to maneuver within seconds where decisions were made in the past minutes, hours. So Project Convergence is one thing that's out there. It's pushing and it's appearing to connect the decision maker to the trigger puller and kind of closing that gap. Are we willing to say and accept that we might be trading, I guess, the targetability of those entities because time is of the essence in the future battle space? And wouldn't we target collection drones, i.e. sea Ukraine, and is there not a difference between sea and space? And whether it's just a thought-provoking question or whether there's an answer out there, I'm happy to hear it. Appreciate it.
No, it certainly is a thought-provoking question. I guess the two quick things I'd say in response to that really quite deep question, in the interest of time, is the first is that in terms of the analogy to space, I didn't get too much into it, Nick, and forgive me for that, but your colleague's question has prompted me. There is a really interesting issue about whether we take the law of armed conflict as applicable at sea and apply it to space, because they sort of look a bit different, global commons, areas beyond sovereignty, and all of that sort of thing. As a former naval lawyer, my inclination is probably that makes a lot of sense. But if you talk to the space lawyers, they are generally vehemently opposed. And so the ability to transfer sort of lex specialis from IHL or LOAC between domains can be tricky. That happens in a range of areas, not just in relation to AI and decision making, but also in relation to the concept of direct participation hostilities, for example, which really doesn't have much meaning at sea. As to the first point you made, no, I agree. AI systems at sea, and this is a really critical question too, and this is something we probably haven't gripped up very strongly as of yet. And that is, at sea, there are legal implications to a distinction between a ship, a system, and a weapon. And knowing what a particular AI thing is in terms of that legal characterization, that legal status, does have implications for targeting and also for what it can do in terms of being a link in the targeting chain. So no, you're spot on. There's still questions to be asked around that.
Thank you so much, Professor McLaughlin. This has been an absolutely, to me, and I think to everybody else, fascinating discussion of a really tough topic about which much has been said, but a lot of new things have been said here. So thank you. I'd like to give each of you a minute or two to make any final thoughts, make any final remarks, and I'll begin with Dr. Turner-Lee.
I was just chatting people. We need to stay in touch. Well, my final thoughts would be this conversation that we had tonight, I think is really important because I think it was mentioned earlier that we often do not think about the various segments in which AI actually lives, right? It's not just in the commercial sector. Again, among the companies that stay in the news, but there are military applications as well as consumer commercial applications and public interest applications that we didn't really get into. All I can say is a shout to Brookings, where I'm at, that we're focused on this stuff. General John Allen, who's our president, has made AI a big stickler point for us, and our work falls in the layers of governance, bias, as well as the national security and cybersecurity threats. So I said, for those who are interested in following, Brookings has a great trail of readings that are available. I think, Marianne, you've been to those events where we've been building upon that commissioned paper series, but we also have a variety of events around that in the various uses of AI. I mean, for myself, and I'll just close here, it's always interesting, again, to be in a cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary role, because I'm able to actually pick up what myself as a policymaker feels is important going forward. So thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. Dr. Turek.
All right, I'll also appreciated the diversity of conversation today, and agree, as we start building more capable AI machine learning systems, as we start delegating decisions to them, it's going to become critically important that we understand the interplay between those systems, the broader socio-technical systems that they're embedded in. So these are really key issues. I learned a lot, actually, again, even though I'm not a policy person, listening to some of the discussion and how others on the panel sort of came at and framed these problems. So again, appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Professor Krebs.
I'll just use, I'll quote from the British action movie Eye in the Sky, and one of the memorable scenes for me, at least, and I write about this in one of the op-eds that I put in the chat earlier, is when Aaron Paul, the drone pilot, is kind of standing up to his commanding officer and say, "Ma'am, I will not release my weapons until you will run the city algorithm again." You have to run the algorithm again. Now, everyone can clearly see, that there is a girl standing there. She's, within the frame of attack. She will probably likely, to die just, by understanding, the factual data that we all have. But it doesn't matter. What everyone can see and what everyone can kind of think, and everyone's moral judgment is, is in play, but still all of that doesn't matter. What we need is the CDE, the collateral damage estimate algorithm, to be run again, no matter what, the limitation or faultiness or whatever, and no one really understand, the specific technology, right, or exactly how it would then make the calculation or recalculate the situation now because of this new image that the drone sensor captured. And so I really want to end with what that means about the new kind of law of war, the narrative of the law of war, and the way that we kind of put down our human judgment, faulty and subjective as it is, in place of or in favor of some other invisible type of complicated mathematical calculations that we're not fully understand.
Thank you. And I want to thank the two Australians on the panel for getting up at the ungodly hour of like 6:30, and my co-moderator Nick for dragging himself off the surfboard to come and co-moderate
really
the
hard,
panel.
but I got it.
Professor McLaughlin, final remarks.
I'd just like to say thank you to all of my comrades on this panel. I think the thing that I will take away from this is something that I already knew, but has just been reinforced. And that is we need to get out of our stovepipes when we're talking about AI. I think about it a particular way. Shiri thinks about it a particular way. Nicole, you think about it a particular way. Matt, you think about it a particular way. Nick, Marianne, we all think about this in our own particular disciplinary ways. But with this, this is a different technology. When we're talking about technology and law of armed conflict, this is a bit different because of precisely because of this human, replication thing that we're thinking about, human decision-making replication we're thinking about. And so it's just reinforces for me how important it is for us to get out of our stovepipes and to engage in these sorts of cross-disciplinary ventures, because that's the only way we're going to make some progress. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Great. Thank you. Great note to end on. So thank you all for attending. Hope you found it interesting. The program has been recorded and will eventually be posted on the ASIL website. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.